Brigham Young, a towering figure in Mormonism, began his professional career as a carpenter and painter. Born in 1801 into a poor Vermont farming family, Brigham Young was the ninth of 11 children. At age 16, Young left home to start a career as a carpenter, painter, and farmer. He married his first wife in 1824, and in 1829, the couple moved to Minden, New York, which was close to the city where Joseph Smith was in the final stages of preparing the Book of Mormon. Although he had converted to Methodism in 1823, Young was drawn towards Smith's newly formed church called the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints from his first encounter with the Book of Mormon in 1830. 2 years later, he was baptized into the Mormon Church and became a missionary. The rest of Young's life was spent in service to the Mormon Church. Brigham Young helped support Joseph Smith against the hostile communities that drove Mormons out of their territories. He carried the Mormon message to England in 1840, gaining many converts among the urban working class. By 1841, his devotion had impressed Joseph Smith so much that Young was made the president of the Quorum of 12 Apostles, the governing body of the church, second in power only to the Mormon leader. When Joseph Smith was murdered by an anti-Mormon mob in 1844, Brigham Young was on the East Coast gathering converts and raising money for the construction of an enormous temple. On his return, Young played a critical role in keeping the persecuted church together. He gathered them to move westwards towards Nebraska. Young hoped that Mormons would at least find the freedom to worship and live as they pleased. Late in 1847, his leadership was confirmed when he was named president and prophet of the church, inheriting the authority that the founder Joseph Smith once had. Young met the challenge of making a new life in Utah by expanding the role and responsibilities of his church. Through the church, he directed political decision-making, economic development, cultural affairs, law enforcement, and education. Young is credited for instituting a church ban against men of black African descent, even though Young's predecessor, Joseph Smith, did not deny black people rights. After settling in Utah in 1848, Young announced the ban, which also forbade blacks from participating in Mormon temple rites such as the endowment. In 1863, Young stated that men or women who mix blood with blacks shall be sentenced to death. To strengthen the church and its authority within Utah, Young constantly encouraged emigration, offering to finance wagon trains so they could make the 1,400-mile trek on foot. Young established Mormon colonies throughout Utah and in the neighboring Arizona, Nevada, and Idaho territories. He also worked to stabilize the church by making its people economically self-sufficient. He encouraged the local manufacture of goods that might otherwise be imported from the East, and he discouraged enterprises like mining that might require or invite outside investors. Shortly after the arrival of Young's pioneers, the new Mormon colonies were incorporated into the United States through the Mexican Cession. Young petitioned the U.S. Congress to create the state of Desiree. The Compromise of 1850 instead carved out the Utah Territory, and Young was installed as governor and superintendent of Indian Affairs. Over the next few years, Young became very successful. The success of the Mormons raised suspicions and provoked opposition from those outside the faith. Federal officials began to fear that Utah would become a theocracy in which church and state were indistinguishable. With the announcement in 1852 that plural marriage or polygamy was a basic tenet of the church, a public outcry began that accused Mormons of immorality. By 1857, these complaints had become so persistent that President James Buchanan, eager to find some way to distract attention from the issue of slavery, finally sent an army into Utah to suppress the Mormons using federal authority. This conflict would be called the Utah War. Young chose to combat the government by cutting off its troops' supply lines rather than engage them in battle. The conflict did give rise to the Mountain Meadows Massacre on September 1857, in which a party of 120 emigrants was murdered by Powhatan Indians and a band of Mormons led by John D. Lee. Despite this, by 1858, Brigham Young had reached reconciliation with the federal government, which issued a pardon for Mormon offenses and allowed the Latter-day Saints to practice their religion and build their community without interference. Over the next decade, Young watched his people and territory thrive. In 1861, Young contracted to build the transcontinental telegraph line from Nebraska to California, and then erected the 1,200-mile Desiree telegraph line from Franklin, Idaho to northern Arizona, to connect all Mormon villages with one another and with Salt Lake City. The Mormons' missionary activities continued to flourish, and Utah's economy and population bloomed. In 1869, the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad at Promontory Point, Utah, posed a challenge to this prosperity by bringing a fresh influx of non-Mormons into the territory. But Young met the challenge by uniting the Mormons' political and economic power. At the same time, he secured passage of women's suffrage in Utah, which increased the number of Mormon voters and diluted the political influence of non-Mormons that the railroad brought into his domain. By the decade's end, federal officials were continuing their efforts to separate church and state in Utah, and the public was resuming its outcry against the Mormon practice of plural marriage. In 1871, Brigham Young was tried under an 1862 law that prohibited polygamy in the U.S. territories. By this time, he had married more than 30 wives, yet he was not convicted. Federal officials also sought to prove Young's association in the Mountain Meadows Massacre 20 years after the fact by bringing John D. Lee to trial in 1877. But Lee refused to implicate the Mormon leader. Brigham Young died shortly after the Lee trial due to a ruptured appendix on August 29, 1877. Even a decade after his death, the Mormons found themselves under attack by the government, who was determined to strip away the economic and political powers of the church. Young was a leading Western colonizer, energetic entrepreneur, clever politician, friend of natives, and effective sermonizer. The Mormon Church remains proof of Brigham Young's hard work and accomplishments.